I'm standing here in a field of cattle. It's actually our milking herd. They are a rare breed. The breed is the red pole, once a dual purpose animal, but now regarded as far too unproductive in terms of milk production compared to a modern animal. But I'm really interested in ultra low input dairy farming, and I think you have to go back genetically to get the right sort of animal to be able to do that. It's often the old genetics that contain the keys to the future. We know ruminants belch methane, and it's regarded as it is a greenhouse gas, and it's, in a lot of people's eyes, it makes the ruminant the sort of the enemy, if you like. But I do see grazed ruminants as part of the solution. So whether it be dairy, beef or sheep, being able to graze outside, to have a diet that is pretty well exclusively forage, slow maturation, but really contributing to a healthy ecosystem through the soil health and the natural cycles of cow dung, all of the sort of insects and birds that really depend on this sort of life cycle through cattle dung and sheep dung, etc., for their own life cycles, and to be able to really sort of create and maintain healthy soils. We've been led very strongly down a particular pathway by the multinational companies of the world. There's huge amounts of money made and invested in plant and animal breeding programs, all to make money for corporations. And it's taking us further and further down this narrowing of our genetic pool for our food. And it means that our diet is changing subtly, but definitely. It is less diverse than it was, and we all know that diversity at all levels is the key to our survival. Diversity in our gut biome, the soil biome, all of these things we need to think about, if you like, in the same sort of context. But we've lost something like 80 or 90% of our food genes in 100 years, and that narrowing is increasing. And for that reason alone, we should hang on to some of our rare breeds. Now, these cattle here, red poles, are a breed that was pretty commonplace up until the 1950s, and then was displaced by the Friesian and then the Holstein and ever more productive animals. But the problem with these modern genes is you can't go ultra low input. They have to have lots of cereal to produce the milk. If you don't give them those cereals, they don't function properly because they're so highly bred, if you like. So they won't get back in calf, and they'll waste away because they're producing so much milk because of the genetic makeup of these animals. On average, a modern dairy cow won't last more than 3 lactations. So she calves at 2, and then she's gone by the time she's 5. And that's because she is so productive that she cannot hold enough body condition to maintain her health. And as a result of that, she's fed a huge amount of grain-based feed, which actually for ruminants isn't best for their health. It creates this condition known as acidosis, which depresses immune function, and all these things conspire together to give the cow a short life. She will produce a heck of a lot of milk in that time. It's not uncommon for a cow to produce 12,000 litres, 12 tonnes of milk in a lactation. But there's a real cost to that. These animals look after themselves pretty well, rather good order, but they don't need any grain. So you can get away with grazing, silage, hay and that sort of thing. And I think subtly that will affect the quality of the milk as well. And one of the things that we're hoping to do is to make cheese. And the characteristics of the cheese are very affected by grazing. One of the things I do agree with people on is that we've got to eat much less meat. So a fraction of the meat that we eat now, we can consume, and it really needs to come from grazing ruminants and a little bit of pig and poultry. But if you look at where most of the cereal goes, it goes down the necks of pigs, poultry, and the intensive production systems, and that's what we've got to get away from. So eating much less meat is definitely part of the future, and the meat has to be from grazed animals. The meat from grazed animals has a much more healthy sort of omega-3 to 6 ratio, which is obviously very important. If we eat less meat, substantially less meat in our diet, it will bring our total sort of, if you like, the housekeeping food bill down. And I think we have to look at it more in that context and probably pay more per kilo of meat because it's produced in a far more responsible way, but eat much less of it. And that meat will also be much better for us. So I think we have to look at it more in a sort of more holistic way. The other problem is that because food is so cheap, we waste far too much, and that's an issue we do really need to get on top of. I mean, very recently, in the last year or so, it was published that we pour 490 million pints of milk away each year. So that's the product from at least 200 dairy farms. It goes down the drain. The reason it goes down the drain is because, you have a sell-by date or a best before date, and people just look at the label, they don't bother to smell it. I mean, today's milk keeps for a sort of an eerily long time, actually. But so they just tip it down the drain. But we've got to be more imaginative in the systems we set up. I do think trees need to play a bigger part in our food system, so food trees, as well as all the other trees that we're planting. Trees are definitely part of the future. But it takes a bit more imagination, perhaps a bit more planning, a bit more work, so we may need to bring more people in on the land. I think that could lead us to being more self-sufficient in food and to be able to feed ourselves more healthily, and probably, reduce the national health bill by 3/4, I should think. The organic farming system has a very strict rule book, and it has to be regenerative, or otherwise we can't go on doing it. So the great thing with the system is that in this huge shock that we had with fertiliser prices, is it doesn't affect us one iota. We don't use these fertilisers, so everything is, if you like, cycles from within our own farm. So, we're returning manures to the land, hence the advantage of the livestock. We have grazing lays, so deep rooting herbal lays, which are pretty good in drought. And those lays are then ploughed out to plant cereal crops, of which we don't have that many, but they all go for human consumption. So rather than, at the moment, 50% of our grain grown in the UK goes back down the necks of animals. So we can have our plentiful supplies of everyday meat, which, as I say, I don't believe is the right way forward. I mean, one of the things that we know very certainly now, and we've got all the scientific evidence to support it, is that ultra-processed food is really bad for our health. And we are the highest consumers of ultra-processed food in Europe. If you look at Tim Spector's books, and ultra-processed food affects our gut biome, which affects our physical health, affects our mental health. And we are now talking, very seriously, and of course the corporates are involved with this in sort of making artificial meat and other sort of protein sources, which in my opinion I would class as ultra-processed foods. I think they're things we haven't evolved with, and I think we need to be pretty careful. In fact, if you think about it, if you think about the multinational food business, it wants to sell its product throughout the world, and it's identical throughout the world, so it's completely uniform. And actually, uniformity is the polar opposite of diversity. And diversity is what we should be looking at all levels, micro to the macro. We don't have a secure food system. We have the just-in-time system, which is pretty fragile, but we're also producing, in terms of self-sufficiency, we're only producing, 60-62% of our food. Well, 25, 30 years ago, we were producing sort of well into the 80s. So, if there was a real global issue, we'd still be able to feed ourselves. And I think that also needs to underpin, the direction in which we take our farming, to be pretty self-sufficient. But at the moment, it's all this. Everything is globalised, so it means we're so dependent on other parts of the world where there are, as well as the sort of political issues, you've got serious climate issues. And we're very lucky in the sort of temperate maritime climate that we can grow an awful lot of food. I actually think that probably breaking down some bigger farming units into smaller farming units with more active farmers. I think we need some more young farmers. It's one of the things that I do feel quite worried about. The average age of farmers now is about 60. Doesn't show any signs at the moment in coming down. It's so capital intensive, but we need to have sort of systems in place that will allow young, intelligent, practical people to come into farming, to control their own business, but to be able to produce food for their locality, as well as supplying into the cities, but much more of a network that is more resilient rather than this big, centralised, corporate controlled system, which is very fragile and sucks all the money out of agriculture rather than reinvesting it. And it's one of the things that has increased so much in the last 50 years is the money that circulates within global agribusiness is increased hugely, but the actual percentage that comes back to the farmer is smaller than it's ever been. And that, if you think about it, is totally unsustainable.